Rochelle, tell us about your first encounter with extraterrestrial life forms.
Probably my first conscious encounter was when I was 18, which is about 10 years ago now, and I could feel lots of presences around me, and they seemed to have their hands on me, and I could smell a very distinctive smell. It smelled like dank jungle vegetation, quite putrid, like decaying vegetation.
I mean, you were in this, like a subconscious state just before sleep?
I was in a very much a conscious state, so it wasn't a subconscious state. I was very much aware of being awake.
So David, tell us about your first reptilian creature experience.
My first reptilian creature experience was when I found myself, I suddenly woke up being in an out-of-body state, and then I saw this strange hand come over the bed, and naturally I was quite scared, as you probably would be, so I kind of like told her to leave, not using those words, probably a bit more aggressive, and then I didn't leave, and so I started praying, and then I thought it left, and then it came back and took me out of my body, and then I followed it.
So what makes you so certain that you weren't just dreaming this?
Probably the feelings and how vivid. It was a very solid, very solid experience.
Can you tell us about some of the experiences people have had with reptilian beings?
It's quite interesting that there's an enormous number that do have encounters with what they believe are dinosaur, lizard-like reptilian beings, and it's again a global thing. Some of them are really scary because they seem to be very huge. I think the fact that it's a reptilian scares them because it's not what they would expect. And what's interesting for me is that often the people that have see these other beings as well, it isn't something that they would normally want to try and imagine. You know, they're not sci-fi fanatics. They're not people that read, you know, that kind of fiction. They would say, look, I don't believe in this stuff, but I am seeing in front of me one of these beings, you know, and I've seen them come into my room.
So what did the creature actually look like?
Reptilian, like a dinosaur, green, scaly skin, rather devoid of emotion. I guess the creature was fairly tall. I didn't want to look at the face.
Can you explain to us how you actually communicated with these creatures? Was it like talking like we are now?
It was almost like a telepathic, well, I would say it'd be a telepathic conversation. What they said to me basically was like downloading of information about how fear controls us. We are totally controlled by fear.
Where do you think that these creatures actually exist? Are they from Earth? Are they... What actually are the creatures?
I think these creatures don't exist on this physical reality that we call Earth. I believe they exist in another dimension. It's really interesting because scientists are starting to realise that reality is not reality. We could be living in the Matrix. This could all be a dream. How time is perhaps not linear. You know, time perhaps does not exist. There is a level of existence where there is all time. You can actually be in the past, present, future at the same point in time. And not only that, you can be everywhere, but nowhere at the same. I mean, these are kind of like Eastern mystical sort of points and stuff like that.
Interestingly, many of them initially are fearful because they don't know what they're experiencing, not necessarily because of what's happened. So that to isolate the fear, is it them or is it me? Fearful because I don't know what's going on. When they actually get to understand it, many of them actually change how they view the experience, and many say they feel a love coming from the beings and a sense of almost kinship with some of them. Some of them will say, look, you know, I feel they're more like family than my human family almost.
Well, let's talk about the reptilian life forms that you've seen.
When I've encountered them, I've more felt their presence around me. The sort of blurry images of them that I've had have been them having a fairly elongated head, narrowing down at the bottom, and having teeth, quite sharp pointed teeth, and quite narrow slit eyes.
Do the reptilian life forms have a particular language?
Most of the communication I've felt from them has been through thought transference. If I was to make some sounds, which I can probably do, that would emit the sort of frequencies that I get from the reptilians, I can definitely do that. It's quite a harsh, quite a harsh sort of vibration, really. Usually when I feel them around, I feel that they are more observing and curious about the nature of our existence.
Do you think that they mean you any harm, or they're trying to get a message across?
There is a lot of debate about the reptilians. What are the reptilian genders? You know, some people think that they're evil creatures which actually dominate this planet. They rule the Illuminati. They rule our leaders. Some people say that they feed off our emotions. The Gnostics, the original followers of Christianity, have that belief. Others say that they actually are part of ourselves, part of our psychic, if everything's connected. Others saying they're beings put here to make us overcome our fear, because there is a belief that fear itself is the limiting fence between our conscious mind and our subconscious mind.
Can you tell us about some of the experience people have had with reptilian beings?
It's quite interesting that there's an enormous number that do have encounters with what they believe are dinosaur, lizard-like reptilian beings, and it's again a global thing. Some of them are really scary because they seem to be very huge.
So can you describe these reptilian creatures that people are seeing?
Well, many of them seem to be about 6 or 7 feet tall, maybe even slightly bigger. Huge frame, snake-like eyes, big snake-like eyes, very overpowering kind of presence, really sort of strong energy. Many of them, I say, feel really fearful of them. They may be a grey, green, or they describe sometimes different colours. But it seems to be the eyes that seem to be the most fearful part of these beings as well. Sort of the big sort of snout here. Some of them have something that seems like a crown or skull scales that go down the back, which you know, some see those, some just see them as a flat back. Very much like one would expect a dinosaur that's evolved into a sentient, conscious creature may very well have evolved into.
Is there a typical encounter that people have with these reptilian creatures?
Typical in the sense that it goes with all contact experiences, that they may very well feel, wake up in bed not being unable to move, for example. They'll have a sense of a presence, an overwhelming presence of someone being in the room. And then for others it may be that they end up being on a craft and will see these creatures. They will have a deep understanding of the being that they've seen. They can describe how it felt to them. They would describe different shades of colour, or how their eyes looked, or the feeling that they got from that being. Hugely detailed, which for me gives it even more credibility as a real experience.
I guess that must be quite unnerving for a lot of these people. How do you help them deal with it?
It's absolutely terrifying for some of them, and they're left with post-traumatic stress disorder because of it. And that's why we know it is a reality, because you don't get those kinds of symptoms from someone who's having a fantasy or, you know, a hallucination. You would not be left with trauma that may last anything from 10, 20 or 30 years. I think the fact that it's a reptilian scares them because it's not what they would expect. And what's interesting for me is that often the people that have see these other beings as well, it isn't something that they would normally want to try and imagine. You know, they're not sci-fi fanatics. They're not people that read, you know, that kind of fiction. They would say, look, I don't believe in this stuff, but I am seeing in front of me one of these beings, you know, and I've seen them come into my room. Interestingly, many of them initially are fearful because they don't know what they're experiencing, not necessarily because of what's happened. So that to isolate the fear, is it them or is it me? Fearful because I don't don't know what's going on. When they actually get to understand it, many of them actually change how they view the experience, and many say they feel a love coming from the beings and a sense of almost kinship with some of them. Some of them will say, look, you know, I feel they're more like family than my human family almost. Sometimes there is a sexual encounter with them as well, which we don't always understand. So there's a lot of fear generated with them as well. And I actually talked to a therapist in America that works in this field, and she told me about her own experience where she walked into the lounge room and standing directly in front of her was this huge reptilian being. But for her it wasn't a scary thing. She felt great love emanating from this reptilian being, and she found herself being drawn to it and actually embracing this being before it literally just disappeared. But it seems to be very real and very tangible for some people when they're feeling a sexual response and this heavy weight on their bodies sometimes. But many also see them on the craft doing various tasks, along with, you know, the greys or humanoids as well.